The legendary Perimeter Multilayer mod is the most cost-effective mod in the entire game. It is so cost-effective, in fact, that it is not worth buying any other mod until your Perimeter Multilayer is completely maxed out. However, today we're going to be looking at mod combinations, specifically a theoretically more useful combination, which would be a solid blockade plus Galvanic hull. So Perimeter and Blockade are the A-slot mods, which are basically just shields, additional shields that help protect you from damage. Hardened Hull is simply a mod that increases your base HP, it's just raw HP increase. Galvanic Hull, on the other hand, specifically protects you against special forms of damage. This includes back damage multiplier, so it will absorb half of the damage that you take if someone shoots you in the back, where you normally take double the damage. Instead, you only take the regular damage, and then your Galvanic Hull takes the rest of that. But it also will mitigate damage from status effects and such like. So the concept is specifically against a Revoker. The Blockade plus Galvanic system would cause you to take no damage from the front, but then only half of what would be double damage from the back. So essentially you're only taking a third of the Revoker DPS during the entire time. Now, even though Perimeter Multilayer, obviously, because it protects you from all sides, it will fully protect you from some number of Revoker shots until it's destroyed. However, it has less base HP. So the question essentially is, will you survive longer if you take no damage for a little while and then full damage after, or will you survive longer if you take 1/3 of that regular damage the entire time? So I've recorded a bunch of side-by-side comparisons with Revoker and with also Stormrack against multiple different types of enemies and also from different angles. So I'm going to pull up that and we're going to talk about the results after. Alright, so here are the charts with the results. This is for Revoker versus Perimeter. This is for Revoker versus Blockade. And then this is for the Stormrack AoE. So an interesting point you might notice is that the Galvanic Hull performed better than the Hardened Hull in almost every scenario. So we can pretty confidently say that Galvanic Hull is a better investment than Hardened Hull specifically. And when it comes to the Perimeter plus Hardened Hull versus the Blockade plus Galvanic Hull, then the original assumption that we made was correct, that the double combo of Blockade and Galvanic Hull is indeed better than purely a Perimeter multilayer, and you can pretty easily determine what the HP of the mech would actually have to be in order for this to be the case. You can set up the equations for how many shots it would take to kill each scenario like this. So the Perimeter multilayer takes some number of shots, we'll call that X. and then you add to that the base HP, however many shots that takes, which we will call Y. However, since Revoker deals 3 times its base damage, then in the perimeter multilayer case, it would be X plus 1/3 of Y. And that is the number of shots it's going to take to kill that specific mech. In the case of Blockade, it's actually a lot simpler, because you're simply taking half of the back damage that's being dealt to you from the Revoker, which is equal to its base damage, so it is simply Y. And then you simply compare these two equations, where the single Y on one side should be greater than the full equation on the other side. To do this, we need to first know what X is, which is not terribly complicated. X is basically guaranteed to be 3 in any scenario, because the shield will stop any full cycle, period. So let's say that both the initial damage and the back damage each take down 1 layer for each Revoker, so that'd be 4 layers gone for each cycle. So you take out 4 of the first cycle, 4 more in the next cycle, there's 1 layer left, which would actually take a full cycle to take down, because the game won't let you start dealing full HP until like the actual shield's fully gone. So that is 3 cycles in that scenario. In a separate scenario where, let's say, the shield is very strong for each layer, you need both of the weapon's initial damage to take down 1 layer, and then each of the back damage hits take down a layer. That's 3 per cycle, and because it's 9 layers, it would still take 3 cycles. In fact, if we're counting Revoker 12, maxed Revoker 12, with a pilot and implants and everything like that, which is what we were using in the comparison, in order for a perimeter multilayer to take any more than 3 cycles to take down, the mech would have to have over 700,000 base HP, which is simply not going to happen, unless you're a parasite, I suppose. So yeah, pretty much what I'm getting at is you can basically write off X as being equal to 3. And so what we're left with is this, and the lowest whole number, anyway, that Y could be equal to, where this side is greater than that side, is 5. So multiplying that number of cycles times the base damage being about 12,500, 12,375 damage per Revoker, multiplied by 2 because there are 2 Revokers, multiplied again by 2 because it has a pilot that doubles the damage output, and you end up with about 250,000 HP that the mech would need to have. However, because the mech also has a pilot, you can divide that by 1.4 and get the mech's base HP that it would have to have. And what we're left with is about 177,000 base HP is around about the pivot point where a Blockade plus Galvanic hull is going to outperform a simple perimeter multilayer. And that's most mechs, actually. Like, any legendary scout has about that much HP. However, that's comparing perimeter multilayer by itself versus a Blockade plus a Galvanic hull. If you were to have both mods plus a Galvanic hull, if you were to have perimeter multilayer plus Galvanic hull versus Blockade plus Galvanic hull, then it's completely different. And you end up with a situation like this, where it still takes 3 shots to take down the perimeter multilayer. However, after that, it is then taking 2/3 of the damage. It takes the full initial damage and then only half the damage from the back. Instead of the raw HP taking only 1/3 of the Y cycles, it would take 2/3 of the Y cycles. And then again, compared to simply Y. And so working this out to the lowest whole number, it would take 10 full cycles for the Blockade to outperform the perimeter in that scenario, which would require a mech doing the whole HP calculation thing again. It would require a mech with base HP of 354,000, roughly, which simply does not exist unless you have a mech with damage resistance. And the interesting thing about damage resistance and Galvanic hull is that, simply put, it doesn't work. Like, when you have a mech with damage resistance of any kind, then the back damage multipliers won't actually trigger, and Galvanic hull won't actually mitigate any of that damage for you. Now, it'll mitigate full-on status effects like Graviton Beam, but it won't mitigate the natural multipliers in the form of back and side damage. You can see that in this clip here. Every single one of the resistance-based mechs, while the ability is active, even though they're taking all of that back damage from the Revoker, their Galvanic hull is not going down whatsoever. And yes, I did test this with every single mech, and the only mechs that this applies to is the resistance ones. So essentially, even though yes, technically Blockade and Galvanic Hull sounds good in theory when you compare it to certain isolated incidents, you could just put the Galvanic Hull onto a perimeter mech and it would perform even better. And there's really no mech that exists that would be able to actually make better use of Blockade, except for maybe Parasite, I suppose, because even though the Galvanic Hull doesn't work, it just has so much raw freaking HP that it doesn't matter. While the ability's active anyway. But then again, you know, does Parasite really care about the damage that it takes while the ability's active? I don't really think so. It's mostly the damage that it takes while the ability's not active, and so in that case, the perimeter would still be the better way to go. So yeah, anyway, that's a lot of, I really hope that you guys were able to, like, actually follow along while I was explaining all of this. It was a lot of technical stuff and math involved in that, but hopefully it makes sense. The TLDR, like, basically the only thing you really need to know is that, in general, Galvanic Hull is more effective than Hardened Hull, but only by a little bit. And Galvanic Hull only protects you from certain things. I personally prefer Hardened Hull because not only is it cheaper, but it's also guaranteed protection against all forms of damage. But it is interesting. I didn't give Galvanic Hull enough credit. Like, I definitely discounted it a lot more than I should have. I figured Hardened Hull was, like, pretty obviously better. I was actually expecting Hardened Hull to perform better in the, like, actual comparison testing portion, but no, Galvanic Hull performed better in basically every scenario. So yeah, I mean, like, it might be worth getting a legendary one if it's for a mech that you think could make good use of it. But with all of that said, that is going to be it for me. Appreciate y'all. Take care.